computer. So thank you for a technical assistance session for the Austin Cultural Trust. Our focus topic today is National Philanthropic Perspectives on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. As you know, it's one of the main tenets of the program, or as you may know, and I will walk through in about 5 minutes the program overview and update. Just for those of you who may not be familiar with the program, we have deep dives of the program in other recordings on the website, which is austinedc.org/cultural-trust. So certainly, please look at those for more detailed information, or I'm happy to meet with anyone about some details about the program. We're going to go into panel introductions to provide you a little bit of insight from the guests that we have here today, and then certainly field some initial questions and other questions or have discussion with you all that are here. Many of you all here on the panel or on the webinar are actual experts in this here locally. And I am new to Austin. I've been here for about 6 months, but I felt that given the role of diversity, equity, and inclusion in our cultural trust, that we could kind of reframe it around some additional national perspectives as well. And I'm super excited to be joined by 2 close colleagues who I spent many years in conference rooms and others trying to make sure that we had culture in the physical infrastructure of New York City. We have Jamie Bennett, who is the interim CEO of the United States Artists and the former executive director for Art Place America. Some of you all may know Jamie from his work at Art Place. I know that they had done some projects here in Austin. And we're also joined by Justin Garrett Moore, who's the program officer, Humanities in Place, which is a new officer position at the Mellon Foundation, and is also an architect planner by trade. And I've worked with many a project in New York with Justin. So they will be able to introduce themselves and their perspectives from their organizations and what they've seen in a little bit. But I'm going to first do a little bit more on the program that we're running currently. Austin Economic Development Corporation is the project manager for the Austin Cultural Trust. The program priorities are truly about the bricks and mortar and facilitating acquisition and preservation of arts, music, and culture facilities within the city, both some new development as well as acquiring existing facilities to relieve the pressure of cost, rent, and tax burden to organizations that continue to see their expenses climb. The most important is that we're achieving the broadest amount of diversity, equity, and inclusion, making sure that we're supporting those organizations of underserved or underrepresented groups that are performing or providing awesome arts, music, and culture in the city, and certainly also facing significant rent increases. We're about providing a permanent affordability infrastructure for culture and creative purposes, and I'm really grateful to see Laura Esparza from the city's Parks Department, who is a key part of that permanent affordable infrastructure. We are really also in this process of the request for proposal, trying to develop a sustaining pipeline of projects as well as that infrastructure, making sure that we're always aware of the needs so that we can be securing those needs in place as funding becomes available. We've initially started out this program, this first round, with about 16.9 million that had been associated, all public funds, both bond funds and hotel occupancy tax funds that had been provided for the initiation of this cultural trust. Each of these pots of money have slightly different strings attached, and certainly we're not asking for the organizations and operators who may be applying for the trust. You don't have to be the expert on how the dollars suit your project. The request for proposals process is really about your needs and your organization and how you need to stay in Austin, both for the development of communities as well as economic reasons as well. So really these just give you a sense of what our initial tranche of funds are, and we do believe that we can leverage this to a broader set of funding partners to be able to accomplish what we are already hearing about, which is significantly more than 16.9 million. So we are very mindful of that. This just starts the process. The request for proposals process is a competitive one. The deadline is March 31st for this first round. We're really looking to support both existing operators in existing locations that are finding the increase of rent to be significant and certainly put them in a potential displacement situation, as well as to develop some new shared spaces for organizations that are looking for certain kinds of spaces that they can't find currently in the city. This is anticipated to hopefully have, 2 to 6 ultimate projects and hopefully more as we can do it, but we want to make meaningful investments that are actually projects that will happen in the short term and certainly accommodate as many organizations as we can in those investments. But certainly we know this is just the beginning of what is needed in the Austin environment. This is an overall schedule and deadline, set of deadlines, which you can see on the website. And our final deadline is March 31st. But this month, and excuse me, I didn't put a glass of water next to me. This month, we have a number of sessions that we've been trying to encourage people to participate in. They're all posted on our website, the recordings. Today is National Philanthropy Perspectives on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Next week on Tuesday, we will be talking about translating vision and business models into space programs. And then the following week, sustaining community and sustaining momentum without and before having a space. And often many of you all on the phone are used to being even between spaces, and how you all actually develop and build momentum through that process is going to be critical. And we will have one final session before the final deadline that will be more real estate focused, and we're working on that currently. The first step to the program, which I don't know if I have that slide, is to register. So if you're not registered as an organization or operator, you won't be getting as many of the updates about all of these technical assistance sessions and office hours. So please register. It is on the austinedc.org/cultural-trust website, and there's 4 or 5 places where it says register here. That's the first step, and then we bring you into the mix and certainly provide you with updated information about the request for proposals. But really, that is the basics for the program update today. If you have additional questions, I'm happy to answer them in the chat. Oh, I know I had one more slide. I wanted to bring people back to the scoring criteria. And the scoring criteria, there are rubrics that are published within the RFP, but just because of the way that some of the funds might work, but also what we're looking to be able to support in this process, there's 2 separate scoring rubrics. On existing venues, 70% of the points are associated with business capacity. And these are existing venues that have been operating, will continue to operate, but for some additional support, will potentially be displaced from their location. 30% of those points are focused on policy alignment for diversity, equity, and inclusion and community impact. Very critical components and points, although business and operating capacity is going to be a primary part of the existing venue, not just an existing organization, but you're applying based on wanting to save your existing space. New venue, which means that you are interested in being in a shared or arts space, and or even if you have an idea of a space in mind, but you are an existing organization or operator, 35% of the points are focused on business capacity, financial and operating capacity, and 65% are for policy alignment. Your approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion, from decision-making about your programming, community that you're building, and ultimately your ability to nurture and create those communities that have been underrepresented, specifically in arts, music, and culture in the past. So again, these are the scoring criteria just in a nutshell so that you can see that. And there's a more detailed scoring rubric in the actual RFP document that you can see. But as you can see, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a key component of both of the types of facilities we're hoping to create, and a key and singular program goal, which is why we are having this conversation today. So we're going to go into the panel discussion, and certainly for any RFP questions, please feel free to put those into the chat and I'm happy to answer them. I would like to reintroduce and have Jamie and Justin introduce themselves and their background. And I've only given them the very highest level explanation on all things Austin right now. And certainly with this group, I'm absolutely happy for a discussion to follow at the end about what's going on here and how that may compare and contrast. So I think I'm going to do Jamie first. Are you there?
I am here. I'm unmuted and here.
I'm going to stop sharing so we can be faces. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much. So should I just introduce myself?
Yes, please.
Awesome. So Jamie Bennett, before I sort of get to my resume, professional credentials, particularly for conversations about DEIL, I think it's important to remember that we're human beings, not just human doings. So there are a couple things that I'll sort of share about the being that is me that may be helpful as you listen to some of the other things I have to say. So I'm actually calling in today as an uninvited guest on the land of the Mississauga, the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, which is more commonly called Toronto, Ontario today. So I'm actually north of the border up in Canada. In my family, I position myself as a son, a brother, an uncle, and a partner. And that family, my entire family, is part of the European diaspora that's here in North America. About half my family came over in 1620 as colonizers, and about half of us came over around 1900 as immigrants. I come from a deeply rooted faith tradition. I'm highly educated. I'm part of the 32% of Americans with a degree from a four-year college. I'm rich. My income puts me in the top 2% of earners in the United States. I've been in recovery since 2009. And as a white male with commercial health insurance, I can expect to live for another 33 years. So a couple of things that are maybe helpful to know about me. So then in terms of the resume, I'm currently, as Anne shared, the interim president and CEO of an organization called the United States Artists that invests in individual artists, unrestricted dollars to individual artists, and it does extraordinary work. But perhaps some of the experience that's even more relevant to this conversation was some work that I did at Art Place America. So Art Place was a 10-year fund where we took philanthropic dollars, about $150 million, and invested them in projects where artists were working as allies in equitable community development. And two of the projects that we invested in were in Austin. One was a partnership with the Fusebox Festival that was actually around doing some community engagement around a commercial redevelopment, public-private partnership, commercial redevelopment of a site, and some different ways of approaching community engagement and community-led design. And the other was a project led by Reverend Osgood called Drawing Lines that was part of the at-large city council redistricting in Austin. And artists were actually brought in to do some mapping to help politicians better understand the districts that they were representing. So more broadly, I've been sort of a utility outfielder for nonprofit arts and culture. I've worked in the fundraising and the fund giving side. I've worked in local and federal. I've never worked in state policy. And most of my experience is at intermediaries. So folks that take big chunks of money from foundations like the Mellon Foundation and redeploy them in more boutique, more bespoke deals. So really excited to be with you all. Wish it was in person, but we'll settle for a Zoom screen. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to Justin.
Great, thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Anne, for the invitation. As you mentioned, we've been colleagues in work related. I have had a pretty long career in New York City. My background is in architecture, design, and urbanism, and so a lot of my work and interests have actually focused more on community and place as sort of a grounding understanding for what might be considered our collective work as being people on the planet, and where and how we do that is important, but also an acknowledgement that many of our systems and policies and practices have been done in ways for a very long time that are framed with inequality and injustices that we have to recognize still exist with us today and really shape so many of our questions and interactions, whether it's about redevelopment or resource allocation or some of our social, cultural, or even political conversations that really frame so much of our opportunities and interactions in communities and in cities. While I was at City Planning and the Public Design Commission in New York City, we did do a number of projects that were explicitly tied to arts and cultural heritage as they were linked to new development. So everything from mixed use projects in places like downtown Brooklyn that incorporated cultural spaces to work with community organizations focused on heritage, such as the Weeksville Heritage Center with public investments and investments in those spaces. But it's always important to kind of understand and remember that the local and community organizations and the artists are often working in low resource, burdened situations and contexts that should be sort of understood and frankly valued, right? There is a tremendous amount of uncompensated labor and under-acknowledged knowledge and power in communities. So it's always important to enter a conversation with that awareness. My current role is at the Mellon Foundation, so one of the nation's largest arts and culture and humanities funders, but with the directive to create a new program area, as Anne mentioned, called Humanities in Place. I'll put a link in the chat that you can see a general overview of that program. And as the name says, we're looking at the role of the humanities, including arts and culture, in place in community. This is undergirded by all of the really important and crucial conversations that have been had and work that's been done around social justice as a frame for understanding this work. So very often people will say diversity, equity, inclusion, the sort of the purpose and intent of that work in many ways, hopefully would be able to advance and hopefully achieve better social justice goals. So Mellon, like many other foundations, has from kind of a high level embraced that work. And the creation of the Humanities in Place program is a recognition that there is a link between social justice or racial justice and what we call spatial justice. Where does investment happen? How is it designed and configured and conditioned? What is kept and maintained and cared for over time are all spatial conditions that directly impact people's communities and their interactions. So in the new funding area at Mellon, so there's obviously the big arts and culture funding that they're doing, things like Creatives with Rebuild, a guaranteed income program for artists, significant investments in both existing and new cultural institutions. We also are now orienting and hopefully leading the frame that the direct investment in the term of art that's used is the built environment, right? The actual spaces that people are occupying can make a huge difference in terms of achieving that power shift in terms of community or sort of cultural relevancy and value in their places. And doing so in a way that acknowledges the years, if not decades, if not centuries of harm and inequality that have shaped so many of our conditions, right? It's not simply the redlining map. Before the redlining map, there were other policies in place. Go back 400 years, there's a much bigger sort of frame that we have to acknowledge that is still present in our communities. So just briefly with our work at the Mellon Foundation, there are different program areas. So arts and culture more directly funds artists and arts and cultural institutions. Our program is funding some of the work that is aligned, I think, with what this Austin initiative is looking at, which is to think about the actual investment in place. So we have a focus what we call keeping and shaping places, an acknowledgement that it's equally important to keep and maintain and care for existing places, and in particular those that have been historically under resourced or marginalized, or in some cases destroyed. And the idea that it's also important to shape places, right? To occupy the space of imagination, of which artists and culture bearers and creatives are so essential in our society to envision what's possible, what's necessary, what is beautiful in our places and communities. And so we're equally resourcing that work. Another branch is what we call evolving institutions, acknowledgement that some institutions, existing institutions, are laden with injustices and inequalities, and there needs to be a transformation of those institutions. And that could be a very local kind of small organization. It could be a well-funded and established organization. It can be your actual government, right? Institutions take many forms. And finally, there's an interest in what we call promoting greater engagement and understanding of the idea that the social interactions that are shaping so many of our interactions do require, and this is really the humanities grounding the work, really greater understanding, knowledge sharing, kind of power shifts that can be expressed in many different ways and in many different places. So I'll leave it with that, but I think the kind of opportunity that you all have in your community in place to think and operate as sort of a community slash city slash network slash humanity, all of it, right? All of your full multitudes of being are quite important. And with that, I think we can turn it over to your questions.
Folks can certainly put things in the chat that I can ask, but I did want to start out with sort of and I thank you both for that basic introduction to kind of the overview. I guess one of the things that I would love to hear, and I'm sure it's different in every philanthropy or every organization as it focuses on this, but can you talk a little bit about how do you almost frame the decision making? I think one of the things that we are working with are some typical processes for evaluating projects and specifically trying to align priorities with the actual dollars that were going to be used. And sometimes I think a scoring rubric can be quite crude, and certainly framing the framing through which people even define what the goals are in terms of very specifics, diversity, equity, and inclusion, are a little crude as well. And sometimes that's legal structures or legal departments that have particular views, but also I think some of the most deserving organizations certainly are under-resourced and don't have the ability to even get their story into the means by which we would evaluate them. And I certainly would love thoughts from you all more on the practicalities of how you match those goals with a process and specifically investments. So I'll guess I'll either, Jamie, do you want to go first? No official next person.
I'm happy to. I guess there may be three things I might offer in response to that. The first was a teaching that we used a lot from our colleagues at PolicyLink. PolicyLink's a national organization that thinks through racial equity and thinks through how racial equity is achieved or not achieved, particularly through public policy and public dollars. And their version of a sort of scoring rubric around DEIL is really three questions, which is who decides, who pays, and who benefits. And so we actually included some of that in our grant making application at ArtPlace, because it tended to be that the people who decided were the people who benefited, but the burden, the costs of the work were borne by a different part of the community. So a rubric like that is relatively simple, relatively transparent. It can make it, as I shared, I've worked in multiple public agencies. It can make it through any legal review, and yet I really think it gets to the heart of the matter. The second thing I might share that we sort of tried to sit with that framework and build it out a little bit is when we were doing our grant making at ArtPlace, we wanted to think a lot about the issue that's commonly framed as gentrification. And what we discovered is that gentrification didn't, at least to us, feel like a very useful frame because it didn't, the conversations didn't lead to people making different decisions. So we reframed our gentrification conversations around displacement, which was actually the harmful effect of gentrification that we wanted to address. And more specifically, we talked about 3 different kinds of displacement. We talked about physical displacement, the way that cities, for instance, can use eminent domain and physically remove private property, remove people from property. Less of that is happening now, but it's still a thing that happens. We talked about financial displacement, which tends to be the kind of gentrification, for instance, in my visits to Austin that we spent a lot of time talking about. As property values go up, but income and personal wealth don't, people can sometimes no longer afford to stay in their rental property. People can no longer afford to pay the property taxes on the piece of property they own. People can no longer afford to shop at the fancier grocery store that replaced the more affordable grocery store. But the third kind that I think is maybe most directly relevant to this conversation is cultural displacement. If there's one thing that human beings are good at, it's knowing for whom a space is intended. And one of the examples we gave is there's a neighborhood in Los Angeles called Echo Park, and Echo Park is 90+ % Spanish speaking. But when the city came in and built a new public space, they put up 0 signage in Spanish, right? So a very clear message was being sent about who that space was intended for, right? And it was not for Spanish speakers. In New York City, when Anne and I were in city government together, our city had a policy of stop and frisk, right? And as an able-bodied white man, cisgendered, who often goes out in a suit and tie, I was never stopped, I was never frisked, and my presence in public space was seen as activating that space. And if I hung around, was doing nothing, I was seen as lingering, right? But if I was in a different body doing those things, my body in that space doing the exact same activity would be read as loitering, right? In Brooklyn, the sort of neo-urbanists, largely white neo-urbanists, got really excited about an intervention like parking day, right? How do we take the little space in front of our building, put down a little bit of fake grass, plop down a chair, and hang out it all day? And that sort of celebrated as a wonderful, tactical urbanism move. But many other communities in Brooklyn were policed when people were hanging out in front of their homes doing the exact same thing. So the sort of third thing that I might offer that was a lesson we learned is to pay attention to when you're regulating identity and when you're behavior, right? Is something a problem only when certain people do it? Is something a good thing only when certain people do it? And I think oftentimes the way we deal with public spaces, we often conflate. So the 3 things I would offer were 1, reading up on Policy Link and thinking about those 3 questions: who decides, who pays, who benefits? Thinking about maybe 3 kinds of displacement as an alternate framing to having a conversation about gentrification: physical, economic, and cultural. And then thirdly, thinking about the differences between regulating identity and regulating behavior. So those are 3 practical things that we've included in grant making decisions that may be useful to y'all.
That's great. And thank you for the y'all, Jamie. So, Justin, before we get to the questions in the chat, which are excellent ones, specifically as it relates to this program, and maybe you can talk a little bit about frameworks of how you as your organization are going to be making decisions or make decisions about investments.
Great, and yeah, I mean, most of it really echoes what Jamie was saying, that the sort of the framework of really who benefits and who's making decisions is absolutely key. So we are looking at where power lies in our funding decisions. In particular, Mellon's the legacy of Mellon has been that most of the access and resources have gone to larger, more established institutions. And so in our grant making at the foundation generally, and in particular with our Amazing Place program, we are looking at the organizations that have not had that access, and to be conscious of that. And sort of interesting to navigate the full complexity of that. So a term that often comes up is quote unquote capacity building, which is an acknowledgement that full resource may not exist for the communities and the places and the organizations and the subjectivities and the content that would like to be seen. So it's essentially a question of how do you not ask people to be in the Black community, right, a magical Negro, right, where you're doing all these things and yet you're performing without the resource, or obviously those dynamics cross a number of different identities, gender, ability, et cetera. And so there has to be, I think, an honesty and a direct conversation about resource and ability that is explicitly a conversation about power and how a place, an organization, a subject needs to, for their instance, navigate how power gets built, reallocated, reframed. And so very often we'll see organizations that they'll sort of try to fit what they see the system requiring of them. And very often it's not sustainable, right, for many reasons. And so to kind of question, the kind of quote unquote sustainability of an organization, that may be about things like your funding and a certain presumption of what governance is and looks like. But there may be other questions about your organization's sustainability. Are you grounded? Are you true to purpose? Are you connected with your community in ways? Those are things that we're often looking at to make sure that there's equal weight in that work and not only, frankly, telling us what we want to hear. Right? We can sort of see when someone is doing that. The other thing I'll say is sort of a different dimension of what Jamie was mentioning, was sort of like the awareness of kind of who benefits, is to also think about reach. And so an organization or an idea that you may be having, obviously you may have your community or someone that may be seen as an audience, or in some cases even a kind of almost like a consumer kind of approach for how the organization would work. But the more that the idea of the reach of your work, the reach of your being, your reach of your identity can have some resonance and some sort of impact, is something that we are seeing makes a big difference for organizations. When things become sort of too contained, it's really a challenge to think about, is there really access and to let's call it the intended kind of beneficiaries. And so that has to be a really conscious decision, and not to go down the gentrification rabbit hole, but all the kind of well-intended sort of expressions and investments and articulations, if that conversation hasn't been had, it very easily can be co-opted by capital and capitalism and commercial interests, right? They're very, very, very good at it, right? And so that intentionality for who you're reaching, where you're reaching, has to have that kind of intention built in. The last thing I'll say is that, and this is obviously sort of a very locally dependent conversation about your local funding landscape and interactions, is how you can be true to the work and the idea and be authentic is so important. And we sometimes see people kind of twist a little bit to get the resources, and you can't blame people for doing that, but frankly, in some cases, it has been harmful to those organizations, and especially to their communities. And that link that I posted earlier, the Hugh Arts, there's this conversation about what is the framework or the sort of the expectations for operating outside of the sort of the complete scarcity or just survival mode. And it's a big challenge, but coming into conversations with funders and with a sort of honesty and transparency of what does it take to get you out of survival mode, right? as kind of your first step, and then what's the dream and the delivery. Like those have to come together. A lot of people, interesting, like they lead with the compelling story, with the dream, the big vision, and it sometimes falls apart because that basic work of kind of the care for the individual, for the community, for the organization hasn't been done, and there has to be a valuing of that in the conversations as well.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be a very particular thing when we're talking about long-term projects with the cultural trust, because some are saving existing places, but some are going to be new facilities, and there's a time lag. So we need folks to think big term, but ultimately those immediate steps. And then thinking around it with what unintended consequences might we create from doing the thing that is important for that organization. So I think that's a tricky one. So I just want to ask the questions that were in the chat, and I think we're a little bit related, and actually I would say is a bit of our own challenge with the scoring rubric and sort of how do we see all the way into organizations through an application process. And so I think the question about, I would imagine the first question was about the application process for this cultural trust relate to the 14th Amendment and using race as a scoring rubric. And then the second one, which is related, because I would love to hear the panelists' perspective on this, on how folks are dealing with this nationally or in other cases, because this is a real issue where legal frameworks are maybe not necessarily always in concert with what our objectives or our goals are. And so in this particular cultural trust scoring rubric and the language within it is, really trying to understand the breadth of how an organization taps into being representative of a community, decisions are being made by that community, and ultimately the programming reflects that community and or others and is very inclusive. Question is, we can't look at an org chart and make a score based on that org chart. I can't put points associated with that, but of course we believe in representation, and certainly the goal to further see that representation in the organizations that we're supporting. So can you just talk a little bit about how either other cities have approached this, other programs may have approached this in a way that certainly we're in sort of this legal framework, but ultimately getting at the goals that we have? Jamie?
So I was going to say, I can share two quick things, both of which I'll preface by saying I'm not a lawyer. And since this is being recorded, I'll repeat, I'm not a lawyer.
I'm not a lawyer
but
either, yes.
But I have consulted with lawyers about these issues. And if you actually look at the current law, the current standing law around affirmative action, you can have race as a determining factor if you do a set of homework. And so if you're willing to make the case about why a certain group or groups have been historically underrepresented, if you're willing to put together a series of action steps about how you're going to increase that representation, and if you're willing to articulate goals for what you're hoping to achieve, then you can put in place a time-bound affirmative action program where race is a determining factor. So that's my understanding from lawyers, that is the case. That said, there are many lawyers, and with love and respect, the Mellon Foundation has one of them, who are still a little bit risk averse. And so, for instance, we ran at United States Artists, we were one of 7 organizations that were part of a coalition that did a $25 million artist relief effort. And so when Ms. Worman said, yeah, but you can't say that race is a determining factor, we actually came up, and I was not part of this, which is why I can be proud of it with no ego. Our colleagues actually came up with a rubric that got at economic vulnerability. And so they asked things like, are you the caretaker of a member of your household? Are you currently consuming more than one medication? You know, a number of other things that in many ways served as a proxy to race, because race is so tied to socioeconomic status in the United States. So we actually made economic vulnerability the criteria. And if anyone's interested, happy to sort of you know, pull back the engine and give you the actual questions and the actual ways we got at that. And it turned out, by looking at economic vulnerability, many of the groups that we wanted to be were overrepresented in the final pool. So we funded many more non-male identified people. We funded many more people of color. We funded many more elders in the process. So sometimes you can look at things that serve as a proxy if you have a legal department like the City of Austin's or the trusts that's saying we're not willing to do the homework or take the risk of having race be a determining factor.
Yeah, definitely agree there. And the, you know, I said earlier, right, the link between race and space in America has been a long project. And so that is one of the sort of tangible versions of that, as well as kind of community and geography. But exactly that sort of, I call it sort of translation work that may need to happen to, you know, say, for example, you know, historically under-resourced communities, or leaders that have been denied access to kind of resource, right? There are many different ways that you can think about and frame these concerns to really meet the objectives in a way. But you know, just a kind of a high level point, and especially, you know, 14th Amendment and all these things. How we all ended up here took a lot of work, energy, collaboration, coordination. Just, I mean, it's sort of incredible when you think about it. And unfortunately, it's going to take a pretty equal amount of the same. And so the kind of homework, as Jamie called it, the kind of research work that's being done is something that groups that are working in kind of coalition, collective, that an independent organization may not be able to do, kind of pulling resources, collaborating, advocating to, you know, whatever power systems are responsible to them to make sure that that work has been done is key. And frankly, kind of co-opting different things that are already happened, right? So, you know, you probably have recent census data. You probably have all sorts of studies and reports that may be done for all sorts of other purposes, and it might be worth looking into some of those things to see how that information could be co-opted for different purposes. The other thing I'll say is that there has to still be a space, though, where we can still have direct conversations about race, or again, gender, like all of the kind of our multiples that are here. And I think it's just a matter of kind of understanding where to kind of keep that space whole and intentional, and to communicate directly, and frankly, having kind of, again, that sort of other space of translation in law that you're sort of understanding, so that you're not kind of operating in a way that you know, rightfully may be challenged by people.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think that certainly a competitive process where certain lines of communication have to happen. I think certainly the follow-up to an RFP process where we're really truly using the information we're receiving as a way of having that conversation is, and then aligning some resources to the next steps would be, I think, really important. I'm going to ask a question. It's a little bit slightly different perspective. So Austin in particular has seen displacement for a long time and is likely to see a bit of a tidal wave in the next few years, just given the market. And I think, and again, I'm not an economic scientist to give you a formal projection on that, but I think it's real in the sense that in order to promote and qualify diversity as one of the strengths that is part of this city and ultimately within the cultural arts ecosystem, there may be a level of reintroduction of diverse populations back into the city, so that, you know, things already folks, artists have had to move out of the city. Certainly activities that they are included in cultural groups, entrepreneurs, food, have moved more regionally, which in some ways is just the way things happen too. But at the same time, there's truly a need to almost reintroduce that this is a place for diversity, equity, and inclusion in physical spaces, as well as the culture and arts and music ecosystem, including, you know, the live music and other kind of features that are features of Austin, but maybe more regional in effect and not necessarily as homegrown and kind of physically in place. So, and that was a bit long-winded, but I guess the question is back to your point, Jamie, originally, which had to do with making sure that spaces feel like they are the space for that diversity to flourish, and making sure that we are creating spaces that kind of reintroduce different communities into place. I wanted to know a little bit more thoughts about that you have with that, because I think Austin's a very particular market. It reminds me a lot of about 15 years ago in New York to now. So certainly maybe some examples of what you've seen successful would be great. What does it truly mean to be authentic in place?
Yeah, so I guess four things is, one, I struggle a little bit with that frame of authenticity, because authenticity often is rooted, when you're talking about authenticity in place and sort of historical designation, historical district designation, it tends to be a specific population at a specific moment in time. So for instance, we funded a project in Juneau, Alaska that was being designed by a Tlingit and Haida architect. So someone who was Native Alaskan architect who was using Native Alaskan designs for a building that was going up in the historic district. And the city council, in what I think is a correct decision given how the policy was written, rejected the design as not authentic to the place, because the historical designation was the 1890s gold rush, when the Tlingit and Haida population had been completely removed. So sometimes wonder about spending a little bit more time with the sort of authentic, you know, are we going back to the Tohono O'odham? Are we thinking about, you know, before there was a Mexico-US border, you know, what is the sort of authenticity of the place? So sort of thing one. Thing two, which is shockingly academic for me with my little BA, is there are two academics I would point to. One is an anthropologist called Alika Wally, who's at the Field Museum in Chicago. And she wrote a very slim white paper on informal arts. And what she was looking primarily at drumming circle in parks in Chicago. And she discovered that arts activity, participating in an arts activity together, produced a master identity that actually transcended race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, country of origin, age, etc. People who sort of did art together created a shared identity that was durable beyond the art experience. And because she was looking at those drumming circles, it was a lot of sort of newer rivals in the United States, and people often use the connections they made through those informal arts activity to then navigate city services. And what I think is interesting about Dr. Wally's paper, particularly with Austin, is that she's actually positing arts participation as one of the only roads to an integrated society that doesn't involve assimilation. I don't need to be more like you to become more tightly bonded than you. I can sort of embrace my Polish ancestry, the polka and the accordion. You can embrace your Argentinian background and the tango and the accordion. And by sort of participating in accordion music together, we can become more tightly bonded. So that's one. And then the last thing I'll offer is there's a sociologist who's actually up here at the University of Toronto called Daniel Silver, who wrote a paper called God, Yoga, and Karate. And he was looking at different social institutions and which of them gathered like people with like, and which of them gather people orthogonally across class. And so, you know, it's been true for 400 years that the most segregated hour in the United States is 10 a.m. on Sunday, right? So churches, houses of worship, tend to gather like with like, as do yoga studios. But dojos, martial arts studios, actually gather folks orthogonally, as do 12-step recovery tables, as do some other sort of social institutions, right? People from across spectrums of society. So I might look at actually which cultural institutions, not just that you're investing in, but which are the ones that are adjacent to them. And are you building neighborhoods that gather like with like? Are you building neighborhoods that gather orthogonally? How do you think about that? And there's another, the sort of third and final professor I'll mention, there's a guy called Carl Grodak, who did a really interesting analysis of different kinds of arts organizations in a similar way to that God, karate, and yoga framework, to think about which of them sort of have local audiences, which have regional audience, which have national, which have international, what kind of outputs they do. So if you take someone like Carl Grodak and someone like Daniel Silver, and then think about which institutions you're putting adjacent to each other, you're beginning to think about the patterns of foot traffic and whether you're integrating Austin or you're balkanizing Austin.
No, that's super helpful, and I'm gonna definitely publish the reading list to all later. So this is good.
And if you need any of the links, just ping me and I'll send them.
Okay, thanks. Justin, thoughts on that? I mean, because I think we do have some neighborhoods that have historic cultural identities, some of which have been formally lost in the physical, but are certainly still known as particular places. And I think wanting to make sure that we are honest and nurturing of that cultural identity, but also be the now of Austin that is also attractive to, and I would say a reintroduction of folks that we want to see in the city long term, kind of who we want to be in the future. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think, in particular in communities where there has been sort of transformation, change, displacement, all of these things, it is important to kind of still understand that the Elizabeth Alexander President Foundation says this all the time, right? The ground still speaks, right? Like those histories are there, obviously, for indigenous communities. It's even more present. But the acknowledgement of the multiple layers of place, I think, is to actually not, and I agree with Jamie on this, that authenticity is one frame, but it's actually difference that needs to be really kind of understood and invested in. The reference I give is there these philosophers, Hart and Negri, and they talk about, instead of like diversity or kind of different types of identities, they always frame things in terms of like the multitude, right? The kind of the complexities that actually exist within a person, like you, a single person, are also a multitude. Amplify that at the scale of the community, and it's the same. And they say that that there are these different cultures that could be different races, ethnicities, genders, sexualities, but also things like different forms of labor and care, right? Different ways of living generally, different views of the world. So like literally being in the same space and experiencing it differently, right? So that difference is something to really kind of connect to, and frankly, the artists and kind of cultural sort of ecology that you have there in Austin are the engine for that, right? And, you would present, on the outside, right? You present that as what you're selling people, frankly, but are you actually doing it, right? Or are you making a singular identity and pretending that it's different, right? So that's like a real direct conversation that you all could be having about your places, your investments, what gets valued and amplified, and what gets resourced. But that kind of embracing of difference and kind of understanding the inequality side of difference, which is typically how rightfully people engage it, like they're going up their hierarchy of needs pyramid, and so they're starting with all the bad differences, invert the pyramid or do them simultaneously at the good differences, and see where and how all of your work can intersect.
That's awesome. And I think I realized that we could spend another 3 hours talking about this. And for those of you who joined us, thank you so much. And I think we certainly, if there's follow-up questions for our panelists or want to bring them back, maybe to Austin and see them at some point, I would love to do that. But I think some of these reframings and perspectives, again, on how do we look at it and how do we have the conversation and direct conversation. Our RFP process for the Cultural Trust is not perfect. And certainly it's building on the shoulders of a lot of work that Austin, advocates, commissions, quality of life boards have been working on. And we've got more work to do here locally, but certainly wanting to make sure that we are keeping attuned to what especially the two of you have learned across the country and certainly in the work that you do. So I am so grateful. Thank you so much. And helpful to have your voices as a part of this work. And thank you for the guests, the folks that have come, and please let me know if you have any follow-up questions for another day. But I'm going to stop the recording and thank you all.